listening to the Labor Notes podcast, our weekly show on rank-and-file news and organizing tactics. I'm Danielle Smith, an organizer at Labor Notes.
And I'm Natascha Elena Uhlmann, a staff writer at Labor Notes.
We're recording this episode just a couple days before a massive statewide day of action on Friday, January 23rd, across Minnesota, where thousands of working people have been planning a day of economic disruption, summed up by the mantra that organizers and religious leaders have been echoing over the past couple of weeks. No work, no school, no shopping. It's an extraordinary effort led by organized labor to pull off a coordinated response to the overlapping crises of this moment. A bleak economic landscape marked by stagnant wages, runaway inflation, and still low union density across the country, all made much, much worse by an administration turning cities like Minneapolis into powder kegs.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like a coincidence that, as you said, we're experiencing economic collapse and this escalation of an authoritarian culture war at the same time, where immigration officers hired rapidly en masse are being entrusted with weapons and vehicles and given quotas and a mandate to protect what many working people think of as a retrograde, false, and racist notion of American identity. We've reached this boiling point after a year of layoffs, funding cuts, and various store and plant closures, all triggered by the usual culprits: management forcing the implementation of the latest sketchy AI tool, or otherwise bringing in automation at the snap of a finger, management union busting, and the federal government targeting immigrant workers in brutal and indiscriminate raids, laying off public service workers, and unilaterally canceling contracts covering more than 1 million federal workers.
Beyond the day of action in Minnesota, there are big opportunities all this year, opened up by contract expirations, for workers to formulate collective demands about our working and living conditions, not to mention our basic rights as workers and people. Natascha and our coworker Keith, who is here today and also made the music you hear at the beginning and end of each episode, reported together last month on some of the biggest expirations coming up that set workers up to get engaged in their unions and build towards strikes and major disruptions. Keith, thank you for being here, and Natascha, thanks for coming into work to co-host the pod as per usual.
Glad to be back.
It's literally my job.
You both wrote the piece One Battle After Another, the big contract fights coming in 2026, a title that I absolutely love, by the way. And listeners can read that on labornotes.org. We've also linked to it in the episode description. Before we get into specific industries, unions, and expiration dates, could you both talk about why these expirations are so important in general and what kind of organizing opportunities do they bring this year in particular?
So when a union contract comes up is usually the time when the most rank and file union members pay attention to what's going on with their union, because there's really fierce stakes all of a sudden where it's not an issue that affects just a few people in the workplace, like a grievance. It's suddenly everybody's contract is up. And you're setting for 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 years the terms under which you're going to work. Everything from working conditions, safety, to pay and benefits can be in there. And so these contract expirations are the time when we're going to see the most union members get engaged in their unions, potentially start to transform their unions into being more democratic and militant working class organizations. It's also the time when unions most often strike. So under U.S. labor law, or the shredded bits left of it, there's a lot more right to strike when you have an expired contract than almost any other time. There's differences in a lot of different kinds of unions, but that's an important reason that we keep an eye on these contract expirations, because if you want to know what strikes are coming up, if you want to see the sort of like schedule of big strikes coming for the year, you look at these contract expirations as when there are deadlines that might kick off big strikes.
Something I also think is worth highlighting are the kinds of protections that workers are fighting for right now, especially in this political context. Members will be bargaining over things like healthcare for retiring workers who aren't quite old enough yet to be eligible for Medicaid, at a time when the Affordable Care Act subsidies are expiring. And of course, they're fighting for better wages and benefits at a time when inflation is turning basic needs like groceries into small luxuries. They're also trying to win more control and restraints over how their bosses introduce AI in the workplace. And they're fighting for protections for immigrant workers at a time where many companies are agreeing to give ICE access to their premises. Keith, do you want to talk a little bit about how workers are seeing union contracts as a place to win basic needs and protections in a political moment when those things are being snatched away?
Sure. So when the boss is being empowered by union busting at the federal level, a contract is a way to get in firm writing a commitment over not just what you're going to get paid, but conditions at work. And we see in healthcare sector, unions trying to draw the line around safe staffing to make sure that their patients' care is protected. Nurses unions are fighting to defend certain patient to worker ratios to make sure they're not too overworked and their patients aren't getting sick or dying because of corporate understaffing. Similar in K through 12 educator unions, we see fights for smaller class sizes. These are examples of how workers can set conditions in their contracts that benefit working people in general, as well as help set a line that's kind of rare for us to be able to set as working people to change the terms of how institutions in our society run. So it's not having to run through elections or government to win these things. It's directly fighting your boss to win these changes. So at a time when the electoral sphere or the federal government can feel very hard to change, these are some really direct tools at our disposal.
I'm curious for both of you, how do you see these contract fights and actions around them connecting to other local organizing around broader political issues?
I think in a moment of constant crises, big contract fights serve as a really critical on-ramp for people to sort of make sure we're all moving in the same direction. I think one example is the upcoming IBEW Local 11 contract fight in Los Angeles, covering 12,000 electrical workers. It's a fight that some members of LAEWA, the Latin American Electrical Workers Alliance, are really taking up, working to build a participatory rank-and-file contract campaign. They've also led important fights on immigrant defense and ensuring that contracts and other important resources are available in Spanish, which is really critical not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it builds a stronger union. If you can't read the contract, you can't defend the contract.
Another important set of fights this year comes in the manufacturing sector, where for rubber and tire manufacturing workers, aluminum, and a few other basic manufacturing sectors, there are big contracts up, particularly with the United Steelworkers Union. Steel itself is another place where there's some big contracts coming up. And these are sectors that have been hugely thrown into disarray by tariffs from the federal government in the last year, where supposedly these tariffs were supposed to protect American manufacturing. Instead, they're being used as excuses or as political cover in some cases for corporations to shift jobs to non-union facilities, or creating huge problems of pricing for inputs. So, for example, tires. There aren't rubber trees in the United States, as a local union officer at a tire plant in Iowa told me as I was researching for this story. They have to import the rubber. If the prices are skyrocketing because there are tariffs on Liberia, it's having huge impacts on their potential job security. And so in all this heated rhetoric around defending American workers, this is where the rubber really hits the road, so to speak, of are workers going to be able to lift their job conditions, whether their corporation wants to or not.
We can get into some of the big expirations coming up for postal workers, UAW members at auto parts suppliers, public higher education workers, Verizon workers who help build its physical infrastructure, and more. But Danielle, considering you lead a workshop on contract campaigns, can you give listeners a bit of a primer on how bargaining works or doesn't, depending on how democratic a union is? And why it can be an opportunity to build pressure not just on the bosses, but union leaders?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll start with what doesn't work, which is what we sometimes might refer to as the negotiations-focused model. And this is sort of, honestly, a model that maybe most people go through, where the focus is really on what's happening at negotiations, and members, or the expectation is that the bargaining committee is going to be the one who's going to win a good contract, and they're going to do it by bargaining just so smartly and well at the table and making like great arguments and like writing great proposal language. And I think what we see is that doesn't tend to be effective because what you're fighting for in a contract is often for bosses to give up their power and leverage in some ways. And it's not something they're going to do just because we ask them. So in the negotiations model, when we chart it, it looks a little bit like a flat line. There's like no actions. It's just bargaining. And then maybe there's like a little spike where, an action is tried at some point when things aren't working. And then, the contract ends up being, whatever people were able to get using that model. And sometimes that includes some wins. But when we're thinking about really building the type of power we're talking about and thinking about the power that can be really transformative both for union members and in what they win for their material lives in society, we think about it as what we might call our campaign mountain. And that is when members are really involved in the process and they are escalating all the way up to their peak of strength, the highest peak of power and leverage they can reach in their campaign to get the boss to give into their demands. And in our Winning a Strong Contract workshop, we talk about doing that through what we refer to as the campaign power spiral, which is basically just this continual loop of feedback and transparency and sharing of information and planning and strategy between bargaining members. An organizing group we might refer to as a contract action team, people who are actually working to organize with members to build out that kind of campaign that can reach its peak of strength. So I think what we find is that when we do things through the, contract campaign model versus the negotiations focused model, we see how members actually build power by building relationships with each other to being ready to take increasingly potentially risky steps, but steps that give them real leverage in their fight with their boss. Now, I have a broader question on the mechanics of contract campaigns. Can you talk about contracts that cover workers across states, national agreements, and even pattern bargaining, and maybe explain why the scope of a campaign matters for building power, coordination, and engagement within the union? And what does the peak of power look like in those kinds of large-scale campaigns?
All right. So union contracts sometimes cover more than just workers in one city. You got a whole state covered in the SEIU Local 1000 contract for state of California workers coming up this year, which is a big one with about 100,000 covered. Then you've got national contracts like the National Association of Letter Carriers, USPS workers, who are about 200,000 members fighting for a contract this year, right after they just finished late bargaining on their last round of contract earlier in 2025. There's a budding member reform movement in that union that's trying to push to demand more and defend the postal service across the country. So that's state level, national level. And then there's something called pattern bargaining, which is an approach in the labor movement where you have targeting not just one employer, but multiple employers in an industry. And you try and target usually the weakest link, which kind of ironically is often the one that's doing the best financially. You find an employer who has a clear profit on the books and is bragging to their investors about how much money they're making. And then the union says, we made that profit. We're coming for you. And we're going to win gains with this employer that are going to then set a pattern for what we're going to demand at all the other employers. And we can go to General Motors and Stellantis and say, hey, Ford gave us this year a 20% raise. If your competitor is doing this, you can afford to do it too. And this is indeed the approach that the United Auto Workers, maybe most known of all, uses in the auto industry for factory workers building cars and trucks. This year, we're going to see really important pattern agreements in the oil refineries, in aluminum, big rubber and tire, steel plants. In a lot of these cases, they'll be seeking provisions to stop plant closures and to stand up to AI surveillance at work at oil refineries, among others. There's also in the auto parts industry, which is very much the lowest paid part of unionized auto work in this country. It's building parts, seats, steering wheels for cars. this is going to be targeted by the UAW for pattern bargaining at about a dozen different plants across the country. So this is an important year for reversing what is a trend over many years where pattern bargaining initially was developed to try and strengthen union hands in taking on employers and say, your competitor gave us this, why can't you give us this? During the 80s, 90s, 2000s, pattern bargaining actually became a way that a lot of unions were pushed by their employers to take the same kind of concessions across different companies. Labor Notes writer, longtime editor Kim Moody has a great piece around this from around 2010, around how pattern bargaining had sort of been inverted to this tool for pushing through concessions by union officers who were not willing to fight and didn't have the membership organized to fight. And this was a big part of how concessions got pushed through the union movement. Recently, we've started to see this turn around with the UAW and hopefully with the steelworkers this year, turning pattern bargaining back into a tool of going on offense.
Yeah, and thinking about, upcoming strikes, we're actually in the middle of one of the largest nurses' strikes in New York City, at least at this time of recording, where nearly 15,000 members of the New York Nurses Association are on the second week of their open-ended strike for better staffing and wages. Check out last week's episode for more on that if you missed it. What other contract expirations are coming up most immediately?
Well, grocery chain executives have a long couple of months ahead. There are a number of UFCW expirations coming up and lasting all throughout the summer. In February, a contract covering about 30,000 UFCW members at grocery giant Stop & Shop will expire. Those members beat back a plan to double their out-of-pocket expenses and increase healthcare premiums by 90%, with a massive 31,000 member strong strike in 2019, as we covered in Labor Notes at the time. It's quite possible management will try to win those concessions again. Then in March, a contract covering 19,000 UFCW Local 99 members across Fry's stores owned by Kroger is up. And then in August, you guessed it, a UFCW Local 75 contract covering 20,000 Kroger workers will expire.
The size of those UFCW grocery contracts always blows my mind when you're talking about tens of thousands of grocery workers at these big state or regional chains all at once. A lot of untapped power there to be built on. Throughout this year, about 300,000 municipal workers in New York State have contracts coming up. It's scattered throughout the year which units have expirations when, but this is going to be a really important kind of labor struggle to watch, especially because new mayor Zoran Mamdani, elected with so much grassroots support from labor, in such a clear kind of vision of building working class power from office, is going to be put to a test of how does that look to have a pro-labor mayor in office at the other side of the bargaining table, trying to build unions, but also trying to manage a complicated city budget. So I think that'll be a good indication to the rest of the labor movement, hopefully, of why we should fight for more independent working class politicians to push our agenda in office. So that will be one to watch. There are major contract expirations coming up throughout the year in healthcare, as we've been talking about, but one I have my eye on is in May for about 16,000 VA workers at veterans hospitals around the country. My mom was a VA worker for about 30 years, so this one's close to my heart. But this is an example of a contract that may not get negotiated at all because of about 1 million federal workers having their contracts declared null and void by the current federal administration. So this is going to be an important test, I think, of a relatively well-organized unit that has been growing in some cases in recent years, of unionized workers within the federal workforce at important hospitals and clinics who may use this contract expiration. Even if the other side of the table isn't showing up, this could be a lightning rod for members to be rallying community support from veterans, other community members they're connected to, and trying to push for a stronger deal and for the respect they deserve.
Labor Notes is also planning to release a contract expirations tracker in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. Also, if you're listening to this and getting ready for a big campaign or even to strike, we want to hear all about it. Tell us more about how you and your coworkers are thinking about your contract campaigns this year, any practice pickets you're working on, and how you're building your stewards networks, etc. Write us or send a voice note to podcast@labornotes.org.
That's our episode. Please rate us or leave us a review on Apple or Spotify. If you're listening to us on Podbean at labornotespodcast.podbean.com, download our episode.
As for events coming up, we have stewards workshops lined up for the next couple months. In February, we've got a stewards workshop on thinking like an organizer on Wednesday, February 18th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. And in March, our stewards workshop will be on the topic of investigating grievances on Monday, March 18th from 8 to 9:30 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be running our Secrets of a Successful Organizer series on Wednesdays, March 4th, 11th, and 18th. Also, our next session of What to Do When Your Union Breaks Your Heart will be on Tuesday, March 17th. You can sign up for all of those at labornotes.org/events.
The Labor Notes podcast is produced by Natascha, Elena, Uhlmann, Cindy Sundar, and myself. Our title music was written and performed by our coworker, who's here, Keith Brower Brown. See you next week. Solidarity, y'all.